Welcome back to Empowerment Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Friedemann. I'm here with Kamla Kapur, who wrote a beautiful book, Rumi Tales of the Spirit, which teaches a lot about life through the wisdom of an ancient mystic, which is Rumi. Now, before the break, I asked Kamla to share a little bit about the question of why we are suffering, which we so often ask ourselves. It's that big question of the unfairness. Why should this happen to us? Or maybe when we are suffering, we are also losing that faith in the universe, faith in life, faith in God. And so there is a story that Rumi is sharing about Ahmed. And I think that was a really wonderful story that can explain a little bit about why the why may not always be so obvious and not so important to be answered right away. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, Ahmed it's a very short story. Ahmed sleeping in an orchard, and sleeping for Rumi is a metaphor for being unaware. And he's sleeping and he's suddenly woken up by somebody whipping him and kicking him and telling him to run, run. So Ahmed is really flabbergasted. Why is this happening to me? And the stranger says to him, eat all these rotten apples. And he eats all these rotten apples. And then the stranger makes him drink enormous amounts of water till Ahmed throws up. And he sees in his vomit a black snake reaching. And so the stranger explains to him that I was hitting you and beating you. I wanted you to get that snake out of yourself. And I was walking by you when I saw you were sleeping with your mouth open and this black snake slithering into your mouth. So Ahmed says, why didn't you just tell me that I'd swallowed a black snake and I could have borne my suffering better? But the stranger says, if I told you that, you would have been afraid. So this story links very directly with what you were talking about, Friedemann, which is that when we are suffering, being whipped and beaten, and we lose our faith in God and ourselves, then we simply have to trust that it is for a purpose, because as all these Rumi stories show, and in my own experience, for example, when I look back at my suffering, I realized that it was always to teach me something. And being human, we cannot seem to learn without suffering. And Rumi says, what is the definition of a Sufi? And the answer is someone who rejoices at the coming of sorrow, because the Sufis are so enlightened that they know that suffering is a gift. It's ultimate. Even though we suffer a lot, we don't want it. We're not like the Sufis. We don't welcome suffering. But I think, we should try and, well, I can't get there, because when I'm suffering, I'm just suffering, and I just make notes to myself, which I find very important. Sometimes I forget to look at my notes when I'm suffering, because I'm suffering so much. But, it's helpful to know that every time I've come out of suffering, tragedies in my life, huge tragedies in my life, that something wonderful has come out of it. It's like Rumi says, the water of life is in the land of darkness. So suffering is very potent medicine. In fact, it's very bitter medicine, but it is necessary for us. And what do you do when you're suffering? And like I said, you don't even remember anything good will come of it. I think the best we can do suffering is to enter, because we get into so much trouble when we try to escape it. For example, I always suffer intensely when I lived 6 months in India. Every time I come to America for 3 weeks, I'm jet lagged, I'm unwell, I'm in the land of darkness, you know. So to remember to endure it, to embrace it, to know that it has an end, and to know that embracing it brings about its end. And how do you embrace it? You know, Rumi teaches us techniques, how to embrace it. One of the time-tested techniques from almost all the traditions I've explored is acceptance. To once you accept your suffering and say that there is a purpose behind it, that, you know, Christians call it God's will, the Sikhs call it hukam. It's a command from the universe that you have to suffer right now. So if you surrender to that suffering and you surrender to that command, which, you know, to endure the suffering, to embrace it, then that hastens its end. I have myself experienced very strongly that to accept that I am suffering now already almost immediately takes away some of the darkness and gives me a path to tread and brings about some light. So
now, when you accept it as that step before a greater learning, for example. So let's say, for example, you had a lot of suffering in your life, and afterwards you could always tell, I learned a lot from it. I actually
yeah,
grew from it. So is it easier to accept when we know there will be growth coming from it, there will be a learning coming from it? Is that something that you experienced as, yeah, easier to be able to sit with it?
yes, absolutely. You know, I can divide my life into two, before and afters, and the most traumatic event of my life was when you know, my previous husband committed suicide, and everything I know about love and loving has come from that episode. And the success of my current marriage has come from that, because you learn what not to do. We are like trees, and the universe prunes us when we're going in the wrong direction, you know. And the way we go in the wrong direction is when we go into, oh, woe is me, why is the universe doing this to me, why me, why do I have to suffer so much? And it's okay to go through phases like that. It's human to go through phase, to not come down on yourself for doing that occasionally, but we must not make it a habit, because as soon as we made it a habit, then we've fallen into the pit and it's impossible to get out of it. So we have to keep making these tiny steps in the right direction.
But that's you know, the second step that you wrote in the book of, you know, the 4 steps of how to deal with suffering. The first one was the acceptance of, now I'm suffering. The second one was also the realization that your suffering was caused by your lack of vigilance. So that
Lack
sounds
of
a little
vigilance.
tricky, because it feels to me then, well, I always have to blame myself when I'm suffering. There's always a sense of, well, it's my fault because I wasn't vigilant. And doesn't that create a hypervigilance of never wanting to make a mistake and always looking over your actions and wondering, do I cause suffering or not? So how can we ever be at peace there?
That's a wonderful question, and a very important one, because we can fall into a vicious circle, like you just said, you know. Well, again, there are many techniques. And I think first I just want to talk a little bit about vigilance. And we can't be vigilant all the time. But what I want to go into is, I think the primary condition for self growth is self love. not the egotistical love that so I'm great and I'm never wrong and everybody else is wrong. Not that kind of egotistical self-love, narcissistic, but the love of oneself, because we are human just like everybody else, and we have to forgive ourselves for being human. One of the things that I do when I'm down on myself is I make a list of all the things I'm doing right, all the things that I'm wonderful at. And I'm wonderful at that because I'm a human. And it is great to be a human. As a human, I'm connected to the worst and the best in us. To focus only on the worst is to shortchange ourselves, is to be very unkind to ourselves. So it is okay for us to have lapses in our vigilance. And we will have lapses in our vigilance and suffer as a result of non-vigilance, because suffering is so important for us to learn to be another way, to transform ourselves, to grow.
But what is the vigilance? Vigilance in what way? How do we practice vigilance?
Vigilance is a huge topic, and I'm writing a whole book about it. But let me just share in very brief that the enemy is within. And the enemy is our thoughts. Rumi has a line, he says he locked himself within his house and he didn't realize that the enemy was inside. And who is the enemy? What is the enemy? The enemy is